After overthrowing the centuries-old Romanov monarchy, Russia emerged from a civil war in 1921 as the newly formed Soviet Union. The world's first Marxist communist state would become one of the biggest and most powerful nations in the world, occupying nearly one-sixth of Earth's land surface, before its fall and ultimate dissolution in 1991, almost 70 years. The United Socialist Soviet Republic, or USSR, was made up of 15 Soviet republics: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine and Uzbekistan. How powerful was USSR during its greatest time? What did the Soviets change in the world? What's its achievement? Let's go through it. The strength of the Soviet Union neither lie on its 1,000-unit tanks and nuclear bombs, nor its advanced aerospace technology or abnormal science education system. These are just the appearance of the Soviet Union's strength, not the root of its strength. Since its birth, the United States has only feared one country, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has many black spots, but a country that can compete with the United States for half a century must have done something right. The Americans are neither afraid of Soviet nuclear weapons, nor Soviet tanks and nuclear submarines. The fundamental reason why Americans feared the Soviet Union was because the Soviet Union possessed an ideology that could destroy the Western world. The communist ideology is the core competitiveness of the Soviet Union. This competitiveness is unprecedented. Americans became fearful of the spread of Soviet communism. This fear was fed by the news media and politicians who portrayed the Soviets as bent on world domination. In communist nations, people were not allowed to own land, follow their religious beliefs, or speak and act freely. Americans were afraid that the Soviets would take over the US and take away their freedoms. Many people equate the Soviet Union with a large Russia. This doesn't seem right. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is a country name without any geographical or national color, which is extremely rare in human history. It is neither Russia nor any nation-state. It is a union with a social system as its name. Ideology is the foundation of its nation. In fact, the 1917 Russian Revolution were both internal and global. Internal causes were primarily the need for accelerated modernization of Russia, its industrialization and transition from a class-based, mainly agrarian society to a modern society with developed industry, science, medicine, and education. Without a revolution in Russia and the social policies implemented in the Soviet Union, it would have been impossible to have a social state in the most developed Western countries, a sharp increase in the standard of living of their workers, or the accessibility of education, health care, and culture to those general populations. The ruling classes in many countries of the world, faced with a very real threat to their domination by the USSR and the leftist movements, were forced to undertake social and economic reforms. One can say that the idea of a new economic policy put forward by Lenin was implemented, in new conditions, by China as a result of reforms by Deng Xiaoping. In modern China, people have great respect for Lenin and the 1917 Russian Revolution. The Chinese know that without this revolution, without the help and example of the Soviet Union, China's unification under the leadership of the Communist Party would not have happened. The Cold War from 1947 to 1991 broke out because the United States and the Soviet Union, the twins of modern human civilization, have reached a crossroads that determine the destiny of humankind. Both countries believe that their belief is right, and they should lead all humankind towards the light. The Cold War period is the most rapid development half a century in the history of humanity. During this period, the two camps fought unprecedentedly to prove who is a better social system, which greatly promoted the progress of humanity. The economy of the Soviet Union was based on state ownership of the means of production, collective farming, and industrial manufacturing. Beginning in 1928, the course of the economy of the Soviet Union was guided by a series of 5-year plans. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union had rapidly evolved from a mainly agrarian society into a major industrial power. Madison Project estimates that the Soviet economy was the second fastest growing, beaten only by Japan, from 1928 to 1970 in terms of GDP per capita. Perhaps the best illustration of how public ownership and planning performed better at raising living standards comes from comparing incomes in Soviet Central Asia with those of neighboring countries in the Middle East and South Asia. In 1928, these areas were in a pristinely pre-industrial state. Under public ownership and planning, incomes grew in Soviet Central Asia to $5,257 per annum by 1989, 32% higher than in neighboring capitalist Turkey, 44% higher than in neighboring capitalist Iran, and 241% higher than in neighboring capitalist Pakistan. In 1950, the Soviet economy was only one-third the size of the U.S. economy, but had grown to almost one-half only 8 years later. By 1975, the CIA estimated that the Soviet economy was 60% as large as the U.S. economy. According to Robert C. Allen, professor of economic history at Oxford University, Soviet GDP per capita grew at an annual rate of 3.4% from 1928 to 1970, but at less than half that rate, 1.3%, from 1970 to 1989. Finally, in 1955, industrial production in the Soviet Union stood at 25 times the level in 1913. There was negligible unemployment and high job security. The whole idea of communist rule is to put everyone to work. He who does not work, neither shall he eat, was one of the things that Marxists openly nicked from Christianity. In the USSR, it translated into the duty to work. During the 1920s, 1930s and especially 1940s, there were times when you could starve to death if you had no employment. One of the epic advantages of communism over capitalism is that it never lets people waste their lives doing nothing. If you find no way to run and hide from the communist state, it always finds a way to keep you employed. A quote from one of Stalin's speeches in 1930 is, "Labor in the USSR is a matter of honor, glory, courage and heroism." Soviet has the most powerful land army in the world, its Red Army. The Red Army began life in 1918 as a small volunteer force of proletarians from the major urban citadels of Bolshevik power in northern and central Russia. By the end of the civil war against the Whites and the various armies of foreign intervention, in the autumn of 1920, it has grown into a mass conscript army of 5 million soldiers. 75% of them were peasants by birth. They were demobilized, with 600,000 men retained to form a regular army. The Red Army, controlled by the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, invaded and annexed non-Russian lands, helping to create the Soviet Union. During World War II, an estimated 12.5 million men and women fought in the Red Army at its peak. The famous event that shows the Soviet Union's powerful military was Exercise Zapad 81 or West 81. Exercise Zapad 81 was the largest military exercise ever to be carried out by the Soviet Union. It was conducted from September 4, 1981, and lasted approximately 8 days. It involved between 100,000 and 150,000 troops. It was a joint operation including elements from all Soviet service branches and introduced several new systems, such as the RSD-10 medium-range strategic missile and the Project 1143 aircraft carrier Kiev. The exercise was, first and foremost, a show of force. Propaganda tapes were made of large-scale offensives concluding in a large victory parade. The Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb codenamed First Lightning on August 29, 1949, 4 years after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, surprising many Western commentators who had expected the U.S. monopoly to last for some time longer. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union had reached rough parity with the United States in some categories of strategic weaponry. At one time, the Soviet Union maintained the world's largest nuclear arsenal in history. At its peak, approximately 45,000 warheads were reached in 1986. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union devoted a quarter of its gross economic output to the defense sector. At the time, the military-industrial complex employed at least one of every 5 adults in the Soviet Union. In some regions of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, at least half of the workforce was employed in defense plants. The comparable U.S. figures were roughly 1/16 of gross national product and about 1 in every 16 workforces. In 1989, 1/4 of the entire Soviet population was engaged in military activities, whether active duty, military production, or civilian military training. The Soviet government also focused on developed planes that would be used for record-breaking flights. The world's largest aircraft, Antonov An-Tu-25 Mriya, is a cargo aircraft designed by Soviet Ukraine within the Soviet Union during the 1980s. It is powered by 6 turbofan engines and is the heaviest aircraft ever built, with a maximum takeoff weight of 640 tons. Buran was the first spaceplane to perform an uncrewed flight, including landing in fully automatic mode. The world's largest helicopter, MiL-V-12. In February 1969, the first prototype lifted a record 31,030 kilograms payload to 2,951 meters. The Soviet accomplishments in space technology are also worth remembering. 1957, launched of the first intercontinental ballistic missile R-7 Semyorka. The R-7 made 28 launches between 1957 and 1961, but was never deployed operationally. A derivative, the R-7A, was deployed from 1959 to 1968. 1957, launched the world's first artificial Earth satellite, Sputnik 1. It was launched into an elliptical low Earth orbit by the USSR on October 4. It orbited for 3 weeks before its batteries died and then orbited silently for 2 months before it fell back into the atmosphere on January 4, 1958. The launch of Sputnik 1 surprised the American public and shattered the perception created by American propaganda of the United States as the technological superpower and the Soviet Union as a backward country. Sputnik also contributed directly to a new emphasis on science and technology in American schools. With a sense of urgency, Congress enacted the 1958 National Defense Education Act, which provided low-interest loans for college tuition to students majoring in maths and science. 1957, first living in orbit, the dog Laika on Sputnik 2. The first animals to space and the first animal to orbit the Earth was Laika, a Soviet space dog. Laika, a stray mongrel from the streets of Moscow, was selected to be the occupant of the Soviet spacecraft Sputnik 2 that was launched into outer space on November 3, 1957. 1959, launch of a missile, the first man-made object to leave the Earth's orbit, Luna 1. 1959, first satellite hit the Moon, Luna 2. Luna 2 was the 6th of the Soviet Union's spacecraft launched to the Moon. It was the first spacecraft to reach the surface of the Moon, and the first human-made object to make contact with another celestial body. 1959, first images of the dark side of the Moon, Luna 3. Luna 3 was the 3rd spacecraft to reach the Moon and the first to send back pictures of the Moon's far side. The pictures were noisy and indistinct, but because the Moon always presents the same face to the Earth, they offered views of a part of the Moon that had never been seen before. 1960, first satellite to be launched to Mars, the Marsnik 1. 1961, first satellite to Venus, Venera 1. 1961, the first person to enter orbit around the Earth, Yuri Gagarin in Vostok 1. On April 12, 1961, aboard the spacecraft Vostok 1, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin becomes the first human being to travel into space. During the flight, the 27-year-old test pilot and industrial technician also became the first man to orbit the planet, a feat accomplished by his space capsule in 89 minutes. The triumph of the Soviet space program in putting the first man into space was a great blow to the United States, which had scheduled its first space flight for May 1961. Moreover, Gagarin had orbited Earth, a feat that eluded the U.S. space program until February 1962, when astronaut John Glenn made 3 orbits in Friendship 7. 1963, first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, Vostok 6. 1971, first space station, Salyut 1. Launched the first space station, Salyut 1 into low Earth orbit by the Soviet Union on April 19, 1971. The Salyut program followed this with 5 more successful launches of 7 more stations. The final module of the program, Zvezda, became the core of the Russian segment of the International Space Station and remains in orbit today. 1971, first satellite in orbit around Mars and landing on Mars 2. Also in 1971, the Soviet Union finally met with success after several attempts to reach the Red Planet. Soviet Union also built the world's first nuclear power station, Obninsk Nuclear Power Station, to generate electricity for a power grid. The power station started operation in June 1954. Kola Superdeep Borehole, the longest and deepest borehole in the world for 19 years. The Kola Superdeep Borehole is the result of a scientific drilling project of the Soviet Union in the Pechengsky district, near the Russian border with Norway, on the Kola Peninsula. The project attempted to drill as deep as possible into the Earth's crust. Soviet Union was a frontrunner in several areas of life at a time. Even before the formation of the USSR, the early Russian Soviet Republic became the world leader in terms of regulating work and vacation time. The June 14, 1918, decree of the Council of People's Commissars on Vacations established an annual 2-week vacation for all workers. What is important, the workers were still paid. Meanwhile, in Europe, far from every country had state-regulated paid vacations for its workers. The 1936 International Labour Organization Convention on Paid Vacations proposed an annual 6-day vacation. The 1918 Labour Code installed a strict 8-hour workday and a 48-hour workweek with a weekly holiday. According to the 1922 Labour Code, all workers who worked continuously for at least 6 months were guaranteed a 2-week vacation. Overtime was to be paid double, and total overtime couldn't exceed 120 hours a year. At that time, these were the most extensive guarantees of rest time around ones that employees of any Western country did not enjoy. Early Bolsheviks sought to level the rights of men and women in their new state. In 1918, according to the new legislation, Soviet women formally had the right to choose their occupation, place of living, gain education, marry and divorce, and have equal salary with male workers. The 1918 Labor Code banned overtime for women and gave them paid vacations for 2 months before and after childbirth. For feeding mothers, regular work breaks were instituted, which was crucial for a country where masses of feeding mothers were put to work, in the fields or industries. The 1936 Constitution of the USSR guaranteed women equal rights in all areas of economic, state, and socio-political life. This meant that women had the right to vote and be elected, in other words, they could become Soviet politicians. National healthcare is funded straight from a special tax paid by the population. The Semashko model, named after its creator Nikolai Semashko, the first People's Commissar or Minister for Healthcare of the USSR, ensured that healthcare was free for everyone. Under this system, medical services are provided by a hierarchical system of state institutions under the control of the Ministry of Healthcare and financed from the national budget. For the country's citizens, medical services are equal and free, with a special emphasis on social hygiene and infectious disease prevention. This became the first national healthcare system in the world, and it was studied and borrowed from Sweden, Ireland, Great Britain, Denmark, Italy and others. Again, all these positive changes took effect in all regions of the country, and although the Soviet medical industry had major supply problems, the availability of free medical help for all citizens was a great milestone in the USSR's history. When the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, Russia was largely an illiterate country. The Central Russian population was only 25% literate, while in Siberia, only 10 to 15% of people had some education, and in Central Asia, over 97% of people couldn't write and read. The expenses for education went up, comprising 13% of the USSR's budget. Education was crucial for building an industrialized state. In 1917 to 1927, over 10 million people were taught to read and write. By 1926, about 80% of the urban population could read and write. National schools and educational institutions also developed. During the first decades after the revolution, written material in native languages of Abazins, Laks, Nogais, Balkars, Tuvans, Adagians etc. were created. In December 1922, a specialized publishing house was established, which produced textbooks in Tatar, Chuvash, Kyrgyz, Adyghe and other languages. Russian was also taught in national schools as a universal language of the USSR. In the 1930s, the policy of mass compulsory education came into effect, but its development was hindered by World War II. Universal 7-year education was introduced in the USSR in 1949. By the end of the 1950s, the country's population was literate. There were over 100 higher educational institutions in different areas of science. In 1958, 10 years of full secondary school education was introduced. As of 1975, there were 856 higher educational institutions in the USSR, including 65 universities, where more than 4.9 million students studied, and this number continued to grow. The USSR made primary and secondary education and science available to any one of its citizens. "80% of the population of the Russian Empire lived in the countryside. With the formation of the Soviet state and industrialization of the economy, vast numbers of people migrated to the cities. But after World War I and the Civil War in Russia, housing construction was impossible, so at first, the Bolsheviks employed oplotniny or crowding together. The families who lived in apartments with more than 9 square meters per person were obliged to accept new tenants in their apartments. Usually, the former wealthy classes had to share their flats with working-class families. Housing construction started in the 1920s in big cities, but a great part of the urban population was still living in barracks, dugout shelters and, at the very best, communal flats. In 1924, the average living area per urban resident was 5.8 square meters, while in some industrial areas, the situation was so dire that a person barely had 1.5 square meters as living quarters. By 1927, over 12 million square meters of new housing were built, but it didn't solve the problem in a rapidly urbanizing country with over 140 million citizens. The situation only worsened during the 1930s and towards World War II. From 1946 until 1952, 78 million square meters of housing were restored or built, and citizens constructed 45 million individual houses. The Soviet people tried to solve the problem independently. To solve the housing issue, in 1956, the Communist Party began the mass construction of Khrushchevkas. They were 5-storied buildings that had 1-, 2-, and 3-room apartments, 80 in total. Although these apartment buildings had many drawbacks, low ceilings, small kitchens and restrooms, poor heat insulation, it provides the opportunity for a Soviet family to live in a separate apartment was priceless. From 1956 to 1963, the national housing stock grew almost twice, from 640 to 1,184 million square meters. More housing was built in the USSR during that period than in the previous 40 years. The housing crisis was still not solved completely. There were communal apartments, dormitories and other forms of co-living. But, since the 1970s, majority of the population lived in individual apartments, leased to them by the state. Later during the post-Soviet years, most of the occupied housing was privatized by Russians and became their private property. Although USSR was not the most powerful country in history when it existed, yet, the Soviet Union was closest of all throughout history to what we can call world domination. It was one of the 2 superpowers in the world. Thanks for watching. I hope you like the video. Leave your comments below. Like and subscribe to my channel.